Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from the CUNY TV Foundation, Capital One Bank, Genova Burns, Gian Tomasi and Webster, New York Community Bank, the Witkoff Group, M&T Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company. Additional funding is provided by grants from AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, Aerial Property Advisors, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, Colliers International NYC, Cushman and Wakefield, Customers Bank, DDG, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Eastern Union Funding, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Gemini Real Estate Advisors LLC, Herrick Feinstein LLP, Hersha Hospitality Trust, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides Centurion Holdings, Margolin Weiner and Evans LLP, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Matone Group, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, New Banks, People's United Bank, RBS Citizens Bank, SJP Properties, Sterling and Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, Urban American, and These Friends.
So some kids wake up one day and they say, I want to be involved with a theater. I really want to be involved with theater production. But in the middle, they end up in the Peace Corps. And then they get involved with these magicians. And then subsequently, they get involved with the ultimate producer. They produce the producers. And a show called Hairspray. And then they go into the cabaret business. What's even nicer is today I have this guy who's a Brooklyn boy, a true Brooklyn boy, a Brooklyn college boy. It's Richard Frankel. Thanks for being here today.
I'm happy to be here.
So let's talk about the grandparents. You know, tell me about the roots of Brooklyn, where I came from. Now, you have to remember, I'm a Lincoln. You are a New Utrecht, okay?
Yes. No, I do have deep roots in Brooklyn. On my mother's side, they came in the early 1880s, and they had
1880s,
and they had a general store in East Flatbush, which was Farms at the time, and they ran the store. And my grandmother told me stories about riding carriages down Ocean Parkway to Coney Island in her youth. She was a milliner, and on my grandfather's side, they also came around that time and were builders in East New York. And my grandfather came in 1885 or so, and as a very small child, and ran away and joined the Army in 1898 and went to the Philippines, very young, like 16, 17 years old. So, but they lived in Brooklyn since.
Let's go back to your mother and father. Tell me about how they met.
They were teachers. My father was eventually a principal. He was a teacher. They were teachers in the same school. My father's family lived in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and my grandfather ran a store, a grocery store. He was a butcher and had a grocery store, and all my uncles, my father worked in the store, and they all went into businesses of various sorts. My father went to NYU, worked in the post office to work his way through college, and he always said he was the only one that got a degree, and eventually they all made a lot more money than he did.
When you were a kid, after your mother passed on, who was a school teacher,
yeah.
your mother, they moved to Borough Park.
Yeah.
Tell me about growing up in Borough Park. I mean, I grew up in Gravesend, so it was a little different.
Well, you know, it was a very insular world, I think. You know, it wasn't as insular as it is now, where it's, you know, mostly Hasidic, but it was more ecumenical than that, you know, at that time. But it still was
See, but the
very
beard
kind
wouldn't
of,
be acceptable. It's not
Yeah.
long enough.
but it was a very kind of closed world. I mean, when I later met people from other places in America, there were more similarities than differences between my upbringing and people who had come from small towns in Kansas. Actually, there weren't outsiders. Everyone was either Jewish or Italian. Everybody was very similar. Everybody's parents did more or less the same things. It was really a very small, sheltered kind of community.
Now, where'd you go to public school?
I went to PS 103 with Bob Isaacson.
And then?
Yeah,
Junior high school?
and then Montauk Junior High School on 43rd Street and 16th Avenue, and then to New Utrecht.
Now, while you knew Utrecht, you had a variety of jobs, and one of them was you were working at Edelman's Delicatessen?
I worked at Edelman's Delicatessen as a busboy. I put newspapers together on Saturday night in a candy store. I delivered for a dry cleaner. I had a variety of jobs like that. But the Edelman's Delicatessen job was probably the most interesting.
Why was it the most?
Well, it was simply,
I mean,
it was
besides the fact that you were able to eat.
Well, and I could eat as much as I wanted of all the deli I wanted. The cooks were very nice to us. It was the 60s, the early 60s, 61, 2, 3. It was Brooklyn. It was the height of the deli era.
Saturday Night Live.
It was
Saturday Night Fever also, right? Yeah.
Well, Saturday Night Fever was.
But that was
down the road.
Lafayette.
That was Lafayette. Yeah. But it was probably the height of the reign of the Brooklyn deli, and it was fun.
So wait a second. How do you end up in the Catskills? You ended up in the Catskills when you were in high school, also, right?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly how. I think someone who worked with my father, I think, was well, I know actually somebody who had been working with my father ran youth programs at the Raleigh Hotel. And I started going up to the Raleigh Hotel in South Fallsburg.
So what did you do at the Raleigh?
Well, I was on the social staff. I was a pool boy in the summer, and I did stuff with the guests on the weekends.
Simon Says?
No, I didn't do that kind. I wasn't a tumbler, no.
Oh, okay.
But I did played games on the toboggan run and such with the guests. I was a camp counselor for a while. But for some reason, I started working the lights in the nightclub, which I was about 15, 16 years old. And it was a big nightclub. It held over 1,000 people. And
they had the knockers, right?
They had the knockers, and we had 3 shows a night. We did an 8 o'clock, 10:30, and a 2 o'clock show in a lounge. So it was a hopping place in the 60s. It attracted a younger crowd than the rest of the Catskills, and it was known for its entertainment. So I was doing the same stuff there that I was doing in high school on the stage crew. I mean, working the stage lights and such.
But tell me how you got interested in the theater and the arts in high school. Because when I was reading one article that you didn't tell me, that you only saw one show when you were young. That was My Fair Lady. Okay.
Yeah, one Broadway show.
One Broadway show. Yeah. But I mean, there was always productions at Utrecht, but there were certain teachers that you were inspirational.
Well, I had 2 theater teachers who were very inspirational, and they were young women, both of them in their 20s, and they were wonderful and inspiring, and it was a very attractive way to spend my time. I think that I was attracted to the theater because of family and esprit. I mean, I've said people work in the theater, especially backstage, for the same reason they become firemen. I mean, they do it. The juice is right. Doing something together. I said juice is doing something together.
Okay, you did tell me that when you were at Edelman's and Kennedy is shot, you and your buddy go down to Washington.
Yeah, so that was 50 years, a few weeks from now. Yeah, he was shot, and I remember I was going to an audition for Diary of Anne Frank. I was auditioning for the when I heard he was shot, and everybody knows what a weekend that was. But I went to Edelman's to go to work. I guess it was Saturday night, and remember I was ironing my white shirt to go to work at Edelman's when Oswald was shot. On the television. We had the television on, and I had the ironing board set up in the living room. And my brother said, "He just shot him." It was you know, it was really astonishing. But I went to work, and late, 10:30, 11 o'clock, I burned my hand on the tea spigot. I opened the spigot and I burned my hand, so I had to go home. I couldn't work anymore. And a friend came in, and we just decided to go to Washington. So we went to the Port Authority bus terminal and took a bus to Washington in the middle of the night. I didn't tell my parents where I was going. I had a friend call them or something. And we stood on line all night to go into the Capitol, and at about 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, we went past the casket in the Capitol.
So you graduate Utrecht, and you go to Brooklyn College.
Yes.
And while you're at Brooklyn College, you get a, I'd call it part-time, but it was really a full-time job because you took classes during the day,
Right.
and then you worked for the legendary Barry Farber.
Yeah, wonderful man. I was still also going up on weekends to work in the mountains, you know, to work in the cabaret there. But no, I worked on the Barry Farber show. It was a 3-hour talk show that we did daily, 5 days a week. And we had actual guests. It wasn't a call-in show. We had to put it together a panel every day, which was you know, like in my world now, it's like being in a casting crisis 5 days a week, because every day we needed 3 or 4 or 5 different people who are experts on particular subject. And I found people, called people, pre-interviewed them, you know, prepared the commercial list and such from traffic, and when we went into the studio and recorded the shows. And then I edited the shows, so for syndication and such. So it was a great learning experience, both in terms of showbiz and deadlines, and in terms of hearing intelligent people speak about intelligent subjects.
So you graduate Brooklyn College, and as many of us, including myself, there were a variety of alternatives. You could have taught, you could have gone to the Army, could have tried to get in the reserves, and you decided to join the Peace Corps.
Yeah, I didn't want to go into the Army. It was the height of Vietnam. I had a low draft number, and I wasn't interested in going into the Army. So the two real choices for me was teaching. I had a teaching license, or I had enough credits for a teaching license, and they were deferring teachers at the time. I mean, people were getting married and having children and doing all sorts of other things to avoid going to the Army. But I could teach, and my parents thought that was the logical thing to do.
Canada was too far away.
Well, it was always sort of the last resort.
Right.
But I took that seriously. But I didn't have to. The Peace Corps seemed so attractive to me. I couldn't imagine why everybody wasn't doing it. They were going to send me to a country. They were going to teach me a language. They were going to. wasn't going to have to. They send me enough
And
money.
you got
to
money,
live.
and
They give you a little bit of money when you come back. I had a couple of $1,000s that they put away for me. And I was going to have this great adventure. I was 20 years old when I graduated college. And I honestly could not imagine why everybody wasn't flocking. And I went to, they trained us in the Virgin Islands, and we had a lot of language training. And I went to Ethiopia I asked for someplace far away from the capital. They sent me to a place that was 10 hours by bus. It was literally the end of the road, past my town. You could drive to my town on a bus or in a Land Rover. Past my town, you had to fly or walk or take a donkey. And there were people out there, too. There were people in towns
now
where
you
had to
you
walk
worked with one person
for a couple of
a lot
hours.
of times, right?
I mean, for a couple of days.
There was one person.
It was what we called a 2-person town. There was one other volunteer there. And we lived in his house together.
Right, and you spent 2 years there.
2 years, yeah, just a little less. But
And then you come back, and then you even get a notice to go to...
Yeah, they were sending me draft notices all the time I was there, and I would write them back and saying, I have this deferment, you're supposed to leave me alone until I come back. And when I came back, literally, you know, most of the day I came back, they sent me a notice to report to Fort Hamilton for my physical, which I failed because I had gotten malaria and dysentery and tapeworms in Ethiopia.
So in addition to having a good 2-year education, earning some money to come back.
Got me a deferment.
You got a deferment.
Yeah, it was perfect.
So now what do you do? I mean, you know.
Well, so I was then sort of free in the way that only people who didn't want to go into the Army can understand at the time, because our lives really were based around, you know, the options were limited to things that would, a lot of people didn't feel that way. I now, parenthetically, feel there should be mandatory national service. It's just that the national service should include, you'd have a choice of going into the
different
Army or
options,
going
right.
to the Peace Corps.
Right. Or,
That would be fair.
or even working on the Indian reservation.
That's right. Or teaching or whatever. I mean, there should be various options, but people should have to
So
serve.
you get to work a little bit on the stage. Right?
Well, so then I started. I was free in a way, and I had this interest in the theater, and I, met a friend from high school actually, and I got a job working on an off-Broadway play as the guy who runs the sound, and I didn't know anything about running sound, so I twiddled the dials.
You knew the lights.
Well, I knew a little bit about lights, not much, but I was learning. It took the first couple of years of doing sort of odd jobs in small theaters. It's interesting. Most people who study theater in college work in gigantic theaters in the college, as you do at Brooklyn College. And you don't work in a theater as big as that for, I think it was 4 or 5 years after I got out of college that I worked in a theater again that was as big as the theater at Brooklyn College. I worked in basements and small theaters on the Lower East Side mostly for the next several years, doing mostly tech work and then stage managing work.
Right. Didn't you go to London?
Yeah, I went with a La Mama tour to Holland, and the tour fell apart, and I stayed and worked at a theater in Holland that did productions in English for a year, and then I went to the UK and I worked touring with a very small company, touring for another year. So I lived at home when I went to Brooklyn College. I graduated college. I had never been really away from home. I went into the Peace Corps for 2 years, came back to New York for 1 year and worked in theater, and then left again for 2 years in Europe.
And then you come back and you get a job for this nonprofit organization.
I started working mostly, I worked at Chelsea Theater Center and the Brooklyn Academy of Music at the time, and I started stage managing. I got my equity card. And then I started working in not-for-profit theaters, doing various administrative jobs.
Including ticket sales, increasing.
Marketing. I worked in marketing. I was a press agent. I wrote grants. I did all sorts of stuff, and I settled into marketing, was what became my little niche. And I worked on subscription sales and press. I became a press agent, and I became a press agent because by that time I knew that I wanted to work on Broadway.
So how does these two guys who were in California, because this is one of the turning points of your life, right? Who were magicians, we would say, sent a letter?
Yeah, I was at, by that time I was the managing director at Circle Rep. I had been the marketing director. I became the managing director, and they wanted, this was Penn Teller, and they wanted to do a theatrical sort of show instead of a magic show. And they wrote a letter to Circle Rep that we should produce them. And Circle Rep wasn't interested. We did Lanford Wilson plays and Sam Shepard and Marsha Norman and very serious stuff. But I optioned it myself, and when I left Circle Rep, I set out to produce their show, which was one of the greatest pieces of theater I or anybody who saw that original little show, had ever seen.
So where'd the show air?
Well, we did it at the West Side Arts on 43rd Street in the downstairs
where subsequently
space.
A couple of months ago you had
we
another.
Did Old Jews telling jokes there too. But that theater had a very low ceiling, has a very low ceiling, and it's a very small space. And Penn, who's 6'6" and wears, wore cowboy boots at the time, was enormous in it and very threatening looking. And it was also
And Teller is
the contact, the relationship between the audience and the stage is very intimate there, which worked very well for what they were doing. It was a great choice of a theater, actually, and it set them off on exactly the right foot. And we did a lot of, it was very important to both of us, to both Penn and Teller and to me, to make this work. And we made a lot of good decisions that worked. We marketed it properly.
7 times they were on the first season of Saturday Night Live?
Yeah, they became, it was like they were shot out of a cannon. They had been magicians and had been making a living as magicians for a while, 8 or 9 years. But they wanted this other avenue, you know, this more popular avenue, and we never said they were magicians. We advertised them as Penn and Teller, and never ever told people that they were magicians, because we figured that people just wouldn't come
To a magic
Who's
show.
going to go to a magic show? Like we said, magic show, I won't go. And that was sort of our motto. And it worked out very well. I mean, the theater community and the Times and Frank Rich discovered them all by themselves. And
So now you're a producer.
they became enormously popular. Yeah, I became a producer. In raising the money for Penn and Teller, I met my partners, Tom Vertel and Steve Baruch. And I had been struggling to raise the money, and they were in the real estate business
Right.
at the time.
They were syndicators.
They were, yeah, co-op converters.
Co-op converters.
And they literally raised the money in a day, the $175,000.
As we said with the 12 disciples, right? They raised it by
Oh, the
12 people.
Yeah.
Right? They made 12 phone calls,
So
and you couldn't believe how fast?
they did that end of it very, very easily. And then we set out and we remain partners to this day, which is almost 30 years later. But now, it used to be that I would run the theatery stuff and teach them what I claimed I knew. I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. And they would raise the money. Now, of course, we all do everything.
So
all
I
learn
mean,
together.
you've had over 24 productions.
Oh, no, in the 60, 70, 80
Okay.
productions.
You've won many Tonys, but the next thing besides Penn and Teller that really catapulted, let's think, was this, I would say, Lieber and Stoller. I really want to do Stoller's life story, but that was Smokey Joe's, right?
Well, that was actually about 10 years later. We built our way. We started with a very small show with Penn and Teller, which wasn't even a play. The second show was Driving Miss Daisy.
Right.
It was a cast of 3. And then Frankie and Johnny and the Claire de Lune, which Terrence McNally's play, which had 2 people in it. And we very gradually learned how to do this and did gradually bigger and bigger shows.
So it's 95.
We did a musical called Song of Singapore in '92, which was the first musical we had ever done. And we had to, I mean, I didn't know anything about orchestrations or orchestrator contracts or dealing with a union or any of that. We basically learned by making mistakes on the job over the years. And the first big musical that we did was Smokey Joe's Cafe,
and that was
in '94. That was a great success. I mean, it ran for 5 years. It's the longest running revue in Broadway history, and was a lot of fun.
And then what happens in 2000? They're
Well,
interviewing producers for the producer?
Yeah, we had done a fair amount by then. We had done Smokey Joe's for 5 years. We had done a very good revival of Sound of Music with Richard Chamberlain. We had done big shows by then, and Mel Brooks was basically auditioning producers. They wrote, he and Susan Stroman and Mike Okrent wrote the show, and then they invited producers to a reading, which we attended, and I had to try and figure out a way to get his attention because I didn't know him.
So you wrote him a letter,
Yes,
right?
I wrote him a letter. I
And
wrote him a
you-
very funny letter.
And the punchline of the letter was, I want to make money, I want
No, the
money.
line in the movie is, "I want that money," and that was one of the lines in the
letter.
in the letter. But I tooted our own horn about how right we were for this, and he responded. He called the next day, and he came and he interviewed us in very carefully and very wisely. He knew everything to ask. He clearly
He knew what he wanted.
He knew what he wanted. He knew what he was doing. I mean, he had been in this game since 1950, and I'm sure that the people he had to deal with in Hollywood were far more difficult than we were. So he selected us along with a few other.
Now, the interesting
entities.
thing that you told me about, certain people want to be angels of the theater. They want to own the show. You and your partners came out with this idea of selling the $10,000 piece, as one would say, and you did a lottery. I mean, for people to become a member of the production of the.
Yeah, we had a lot of investors who we took small amounts. We took $10,000 from people, and We had a lot of people who wanted to be involved in the producers, so we had a lottery, which was great. Because the people who got closed out of the lottery were crazy mad to stay involved with us on the next show and the show after that.
And that was Hairspray.
Then the next show turned out to be Hairspray. We also had to have a lottery for Hairspray. We have, not that I'm counting, we have 6 Tonys and 2 Olivier Awards.
How did you decide later on, 2 years ago or so, maybe a year and a half ago, you and your partners to get into the cabaret business and the restaurant business?
Well, you know, we'd always wanted to do it. I mean, who doesn't want to own a bar? You know, we always wanted to do it. It was always attractive. In the cabaret business, my partners had run a cabaret in college, and we had done the Song of Singapore, which was a cabaret thing. And in our stupidity, we also thought that this would be a steady job, as opposed to going from one show to another, which is what we have done with our lives. This would be something that could have a long future, and it still will, I hope. But it was a lot more difficult to get on its feet than we imagined. But now, thankfully, it appears that we're
54
stable.
Below.
54 Below. It's a wondrous place, a magical place, and it appears now to be approaching stability.
Right, it's a great cabaret facility and a restaurant. Your
Yeah.
wife, and tell me about the kids. You're married to?
I've been married twice. I have a son from my first marriage who's 33. Just had a daughter.
And the name of your son and your daughter, and the granddaughter?
Is Josh and Eve, and my granddaughter's name is Phoenix, and they are both artists, Josh and Eve. She's a painter and sculptor, and he's a digital artist.
And
Works
your
on
wife
movies.
is?
My wife is Kathleen Clark, who's a terrific playwright. She's had several plays produced in New York. We have 2 kids, Clark and Liz is a senior in theater at University of Michigan, and Clark is an editor, a video editor for Upright Citizens Brigade.
It's always having fun with the Brooklyn boys. And even though I'm the Lincoln guy, I always have the affinity to New Utrecht, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.